Hello and welcome to the RDS Library Speaker Series. Today I'm going to talk about some work I've been doing over several decades, but particularly about my book Irish Country Furniture and Furnishings, 1700 to 2000. This is a book which is substantially bigger and enlarged compared to a book I wrote 30 years ago, which was called Irish Country Furniture, 1700 to 1950. So I've been asked to talk about the making of this newly enlarged book. So I'm going to look back at some of the photographs I took 30 years ago for this book and discuss some of the stories behind them. And some of the stories behind the recent work that I've done in the last 4 or 5 years, revising it and updating it. So I'll come to the first slide, which shows a photograph I took in 1989. At this point, I was knocking on doors all over Ireland to try and find authentic furniture in its original surroundings. So this was exactly the sort of farmhouse I was turning up at. And these people, this is a brother and a sister, you can see outside their little farmhouse in Inishowen in the north of County Donegal in the north of Ireland. So I was able to go inside this house, and it was one of the most exciting houses because it still had all its original furniture in it. It was barely modernized, and that was the kind of thing I was looking for. So now I'll go inside and I'll show you what I found inside. This is the kitchen of the woman that you just saw outside. So her dresser, for example, would have been the pride of the kitchen, and we'll look at a few dressers this morning, but this dresser has a totally traditional arrangement of basins on the middle shelf, all upside down, arranged in a completely traditional way. Big meat platters on the top shelf, leant forward onto bars to stop the dust settling on their patterns, and everything else arranged in this very traditional way. This house doesn't have a stainless steel sink. It doesn't have a modern kitchen as we know it today. So the kitchen table was the worktop for everything that was done. Recently revising this work and going back to these much more important pictures now that I look at them 30 years later, it's sort of tragic to think that I couldn't go back into these houses again because they're gone. And this is a reminder, actually. Recently, a friend of mine in Donegal sent me a photograph of this house as it is now. And it's so shocking to see it with the roof fallen in and completely derelict, and all the furniture inside gone. So that's a reminder of how important these early pictures were, and how interesting it is to revisit them, a little bit like laying down old wine and finding it's much, much better after a few years. So that's a contrast to the kind of work I've been doing more recently, which is looking in museum collections and finding out what they've got. Since I did that work in the late 1980s and 1990s. So I'm a curator at the Ulster Folk and Transport Museum currently, and I look at objects. And so my first visit there last year in 2019, on my last day, I thought when I was up in Belfast, I just thought I'll take some pictures that might be useful for the book. So this is my typical journey to work, walking along this little grassy boreen and coming across these goats, and in the background you can see a thatched house which I was heading for. I'd already been inside it and I thought this looked like a really lovely photographic shoot. So there's the front of the house with its thatch, with its half door. The Ulster Folk Museum reconstructs all these extraordinary houses exactly as they were before. And this is the Ballyvanemore farmhouse from County Down, from the mountains of Mourne. So inside, they've actually got all the furniture which was appropriate to the house at the time. That the whole house was given to the Ulster Folk Museum, and they were able to reconstruct everything more or less exactly as it used to be. So the dresser is the dresser that was originally in that house. And there it is, and you can see the half door, the red half door on one side, open to let the light in for my photograph, and the dash churn and everything else. It was just wonderful, lovely, beautiful. After a few minutes, the goats followed me up the path and in through the half door, and this was not what I'd expected at all, and they immediately began to cause havoc. So I had to shoo them out, and I was reminded then what that half door was for the farmer's wife, it would have separated the wildlife from outside, from the domestic environment inside. So the half door was literally keeping out the livestock, keeping in little children, keeping them separate, and yet allowing light to come in. So that was a really nice reminder, and it was a, typically funny, lovely morning's work. Looking at the ceiling of that farmhouse, I had been struck at how light it was, and it took me a little while to realise why. And that's because the whole of the ceiling, which would have been dark with the underside of the thatch, had been lined underneath with flour bags. Now, flour bags turn out to be something that people commonly recycled. They just gathered them, they scrubbed off all the print, they used them for everything from clothing to aprons to curtains to tablecloths, everything that you would use textiles for, they recycled their flour bags into. And they even carefully unpicked the thread and used the thread again. So this flour bag ceiling enabled the kitchen to be bright and light and lovely. And when I was working in Cork Public Museum in Cork City, I came across a flour bag that had this extraordinary label on it that says, "To remove this label, soak in water." So the flour companies, the millers, knew that the flour bags were desirable and that they'd be washing off the print. And I thought it was really interesting that they put this message on that told you that the print would wash off beautifully, because of course you didn't want the print on the flour bag at all. So that's interesting, there's a flour bag ceiling in that particular house. And of course, having that white ceiling above the dresser enabled my book designers to choose it for the front cover of my book, which is great actually. So there it is, with its flour bag ceiling sort of blending up into the title. Now, other people had dresses as well, of course, and they were generally the pride of the Irish kitchen. So this is one of the most exciting new photographs that I've managed to incorporate in the new book. And it's a picture of an Irish celebrity called Peg Sayers. Most Irish people who learnt to speak Irish in Irish schools would know who Peg Sayers was. But she was photographed by an American magazine in 1940, and the photographer had her pose in front of the dresser. So here is Peg Sayers standing in front of her dresser, which is terribly interesting to me because she's got all sorts of extraordinary things arranged on it. It was the pride of the kitchen. It was her status symbol. And at this point, well, she lived on the Great Blasket Island on the coast of Kerry. So she had fishing floats, glass fishing floats along the top of the dresser. And I've bought a glass fishing float. I've actually got glass fishing floats along the top of my dresser. They're lovely things. And ever since my childhood in County Cork, we used to collect them, and now they're really not there anymore. So these glass fishing floats were lovely along the top of lots of people's dressers. And the other thing that she had, which is written in the magazine caption, is electric light bulbs. On the far right of that picture, above where I've put the date, there are 3 electric light bulbs. So the Blasket Islanders collected all sorts of things, and electric light bulbs were a curio. There was no electricity on the island, but they put them on show, and they would have been a conversation piece. So Peg Sayers' dresser has got so much interesting stuff, including jam jars, which we now take for granted, but they were precious, they were arranged, they were all polished. So all this lovely glass would have looked lovely amongst her basins and her plates and her loaf of bread, which of course was her produce too. So that's the Blasket Island, which has all sorts of interesting history, but that particular dresser is a really important one for me. Something else from the Blasket Island that turned up very recently, actually during the spring of 2020, during the pandemic, this came to light. This is a deck chair from the shipwreck of the Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania was sunk off the coast of Cork in 1915, and it was a tragedy that there was a loss of 1,198 lives on this luxury liner that was coming from New York across the Atlantic. She was torpedoed by a U-boat, and that action is what brought the Americans into the war. So a lot of people know about the wreck of the Lusitania, but I didn't know about all the flotsam and jetsam that came off the shipwreck, as well as the deaths, of course. So people were looking out not only for bodies, but for objects. And the Blasket Islanders came across this deck chair, which is a six-legged chair. It's made of beech, it has bronze fittings. It would have been a really top-class, beautiful object when it was new. And quite a lot of deck chairs floated in and have ended up in different houses along the Cork coast. Exactly the same design was used on the Titanic. So in New York, there's a deck chair almost identical to this with its footrest, which is missing here from the Titanic. So looking at this as a furniture historian, it's a fascinating object. It's very comfortable, it's made to fold, and to think of it ending up by the fire, by the turf fire in a little cottage on the Blasket Island, and the conversations that must have revolved around its use, because for sure people would have sat on it, is fascinating to me. And it's been painted many times, which is a traditional thing. So it has layers of red and green and blue paint, which makes me imagine that it would have matched the dresser, it would have matched the other things in the kitchen, because usually that was the way that things were done. So this chair is so interesting in many ways. And when the Blasket Islanders were evacuated from that island in 1953, there's a wonderful photograph of four men coming up the slip, and one of them is holding the deck chair folded in one hand. It was so precious, it was taken with them and brought ashore, and now it's in the Blasket Island Centre. Of course, this isn't a typical example of vernacular furniture. This is more typical. These are Sugorn chairs, and I'm very interested in the history of the people who made these things. Vernacular furniture is very often anonymous. So coming across Christy Sullivan, who was a chairmaker who died in 1998, and I used to go and visit him in Kerry repeatedly in his workshop. You can see him here holding two chairs in his hands, and he was the maker of Sugorn chairs. And Sugorn chairs were a traditional type of chair with a homemade seat made of twisted straw or twisted hay rope. So he's got this twisted straw seat on his Sugorn chair, which he's holding in his right hand. And I brought one with me. He made quite a lot of them. He was a proper vernacular maker. This was poor man's upholstery, really, and you could replace it yourself with your own rope. Subsequently, people used fishing twine for the seats when they stopped using Sugorn. So you can see the chair in the middle with the green seat. That little chair has a fishing twine seat. And then at the extreme right-hand side of the picture, we've got a chair made in the 1970s by Garrett Fitzgerald in Kerry, and he was using recycled teak from teak windows. So when people having a teak windows pulled out and putting PVC windows in instead, he was rescuing the teak and making it into Sugorn chairs. But his, of course, are much higher, they're much more appropriate for us tall people compared to the smaller chairs from the 18th and 19th centuries. So that slide shows just how much smaller chairs were and how much lower people sat next to the open turf fire in the 18th and 19th centuries. And Sugorn chairs can be traced right back in inventories, right back to the 17th century. The word Sugorn chair shows us that continuity. So that's interesting to see that change going on through time. I'm very interested in how frugal Irish householders were with their materials. And when I went back to the museums just to see what had been collected since my first sort of swathe of research in the late 1980s, I was particularly excited to see this little household shrine in amongst the stores in the National Museum in County Mayo. And there were a few shrines there, but I thought, I'll look at this blue and white one because it looks interesting. So I started photographing it, and I set it all up, and I was figuring it all out. And then I turned it around and I looked at the back, and I was amazed to see that the back revealed the fact that it was completely made out of packing cases. So we have accession for this, and it was made by somebody called Frank Weir, who apparently recycled butter boxes and crates and made these little shrines and gave them to members of his family on special occasions. So there's a lot of detail about this, and when we look at the newspaper that he used around the back to seal it up, it tells us that it was made no earlier than 1904. So this little household shrine is really extraordinary in terms of the fact it was made from virtually nothing. It was just recycled and painted crates from Barrington soap, and actually if you read the logo on the back, it says, "In use unsurpassed," referring to the Dublin soap makers' slogan. So these have been some of the stories behind the making of this new book and the making of the book that I wrote much longer ago that was published in 1993. So, you know, the flower bag ceiling, I didn't really know about flower bags when I first did this research. You know, but it's been amazingly exciting for me. The research is always such fun. As a writer, research is always the best bit. It's like the fishing trip rather than coming home and finishing off. It's gathering all the material is wonderful. So it's been terribly interesting. The field work that underpinned all my original first research is something which at the time, I suppose I realised that I was visiting people who were really extraordinary and I couldn't visit again. But 30 years later, those photographs, which I've had to scan and digitise and sometimes do a bit of Photoshop to make them publishable, you know, they are really so much more interesting now than they even were in 1993. And it's really interesting to bring them back to the fore. But it's fascinating to go to museums which now are presenting this authentic interior so well. I mean, the Ulster Folk Museum is probably one of the best folk museums in the whole of Europe, if not the world. It's just brilliant the way they're putting things across. And vernacular furniture really needs to be seen in its context, under its thatched roof, next to the turf fire, with the smell and tasting the bread and everything else that goes on in these places is extraordinary. So that's very interesting to bring in more contextual material and then compare it to what the museums have now collected in the last 30 years as well to add to their collections is a great juxtaposition and add a whole lot more research, you know, thanks to bursaries like I've had at the Royal Dublin Society, in the Library and Archives in 2018. It was wonderful to spend 6 months there looking really closely into all their archives and do a lot more new research at that point. And then also in Galway with my research fellowship, which has been wonderful, where I did my research into spoons and noggins based on that work. I hope very much that you've enjoyed having a glimpse of some of the pictures that I've taken over the years. I hope it's helped enhance your appreciation of some of our Irish heritage, which I do think is really extraordinary. And I also think the sustainability which comes out through this frugality is so poignant today. It's so relevant today. We're all thinking about how we can be saving things and using them more carefully, and there we have the pattern for it in our own history. So thank you very much.